gather back around as we carry on with our Distillers Grain Forum this morning. We talked a little bit about the world of possibilities this morning and potential in different areas. And now we're going to talk about some resources and some potential new avenues to make some of those things this morning happen. I am just going to, we have with us Dr. Kurt Rosentrotter with Distillers Grains Technology Council out of Iowa State University with us this morning. We also have a variety of folks: Kristina Slattery, Annie Franklin, Angelica Sanchez Vega, Ellie Puckett, and Ann M. Franklin from both the Cabinet for Economic Development and the Governor's Office of Agricultural Policy that are going to be talking about various and sundry things. So we're going to start out with Kurt, and then we'll move on to everybody else. We have a group presentation because they all sort of feed into one another in terms of those programs and how they overlap. So I am going to turn this over to, I believe Carrie Johnson is doing your presentation, correct, Kurt?
I think so, yes.
All right, if we can mute our all right.
Excellent.
Good deal.
Thank you very much. Technology is a wonderful thing, isn't it? But it's always has its downside. So today I've had computer problems myself. So I want to take a couple of minutes and talk a little bit about the Distillers Grains Technology Council, and also talk about some of the activities that we work on and some other thoughts. So if we could go to the next slide, Carrie, please. So specifically, I want to talk about the council. The council has been around for about 75 years, and we work on a variety of issues related to stillage and distillers grains and distillers products, and talk a little bit about economics and dewatering, which is going to be critical to some of the activities that we are talking about today. And then I do want to spend a minute and talk about some of the regulatory issues, especially as we are thinking about new products. Next slide. So the Distillers Grains Technology Council, it's an organization that was developed back in 1945, and it was developed in response to questions that we are trying to answer today, actually. So the old saying about what's new is actually old, or what's old is new again, it really rings true. So next slide. So, back one. Sorry, forward one. So our mission as an organization is to encompass a broad array of interests, both from industry as well as livestock producers. We work with the beverage industry, we work with biofuels industry, we work with livestock industries, and we work with other industrial fermentation industries. So we provide support to all of the industries that we engage with in terms of technical support, either in-house technical capabilities or connecting companies to resources. If it's, for example, dewatering stillage, types of processes or equipment, or if there is a company who's interested in purchasing distillers products, we try to connect companies and provide technical support. We spend a lot of time every year doing advocacy and education. So we really try to promote distillers products, a variety of distillers products, both on the regulatory side, working with FDA, working with AFCO, working with state regulatory agencies, but also working with other agencies such as USDA and the Foreign Ag Service. So we work specifically on nutrition, on efficacy, on safety, and on transportation and logistics in terms of the advocacy. And we also try to help support market development, not just for existing products, but for new products, both inside the United States and increasingly outside the United States as well. Next slide. So every year, I think there was mention of it this morning, we typically have a symposium in May every year where we spend a day and a half having speakers talk about the latest and greatest information, both from a production side, but also utilization side, beef, dairy, swine, poultry, but other novel uses. Some of the speakers we've had this morning have spoken at my symposium in the last couple of years. We also attend different conferences and trade shows to promote distillers grains and distillers products. We, like I said, spend a lot of time every year working with the regulatory agencies to try to help them understand how the products are being produced, their safety, their efficacy, and basically to prove that our industries are doing what they need to in order to meet compliance. And we're producing safe and effective animal feed ingredients. So as I mentioned, we work with fuel, beverage, and industrial producers. We do have different levels of membership. And ironically, we have also collected a large contingent of published literature going back to the 1800s, because let's face it, our industry has been around for quite some time. And so the questions we're trying to answer, there's been a lot of research that's been done, at least published research, since the 1800s. So next slide, please. So our organization was formed in 1945 by a couple of companies that you might have heard of, Hiram Walker and Seagram's. So the reason this organization was formed was because the states of Kentucky and Tennessee, ironically, passed legislation to prevent the dumping of stillage into the rivers. And so the large distilleries at the time decided they needed to find ways to utilize stillage. So as I mentioned, what's old is new. So next slide, please. One more forward. So just to give you a brief idea, in the 1800s, really, we're exporting distillers grains outside of the United States, primarily to Europe as animal feeds. So the questions that Seagram's and Hiram Walker were trying to ask and answer, really at that time, there were solutions. So originally our organization was founded in Cincinnati. And what the organization had focused on for many decades was conducting feeding trials with beef, with dairy, with swine, with poultry, publications, annual symposium, and to try to help livestock producers understand what is the value in stillage. Next slide, please. So these are some pictures from some of the first symposia that my organization hosted back in the 1950s. Unfortunately, I've been trying to get permission to bring livestock into our current symposia, but the hotels apparently don't allow cows inside the showrooms anymore. So, but we're working on that. So hopefully we will be able to host our symposium in May in Louisville, but I'm not sure. We'll kind of have to play that by ear. It may actually turn out to be a virtual symposium this year, which would mean we'll be in Louisville next year instead of 2021. So next slide, please. It is really interesting when you look at the literature too, because back in the 40s and 50s, you really started to see publications in terms of separating stillage, processing stillage, utilizing stillage. And the fuel ethanol industry has really taken these ideas and these concepts and really further developed those over the last several decades. Next slide, please. So just briefly, a few ideas that I want to share with you. When we think about selling stillage as a livestock feed ingredient, or we think about processing the stillage into a dried format or some other type of format, or some type of a new ingredient, we have to be cognizant of competition. And what are we going to be competing with? And it's not just the state of Kentucky we have to think about. We have to think about commodities throughout all of the country. And the two primary competing ingredients are going to be corn and soybean meal. Those are the competition that we face. Next slide, please. So every year, there are somewhere between 35 and 40 million metric tons of distillers grains that are produced in the United States. And the vast majority are going to be produced by the fuel ethanol industry. It is almost a 50-50 split between wet and dry, the distillers wet grains and the distillers dry grains. And sometimes solubles are added back and sometimes they're not. But the fuel ethanol industry over the last 15 to 20 years has grown exponentially. And so when we think about using stillage in a wet form or drying it into a dried form, we will be competing with the fuel ethanol folks and their products. And so 40 million metric tons, it varies. It's either the #1 produced feed ingredient in the United States or the #2. Soybean meal is a stiff competitor for any distillers products. Soybean meal has a higher protein level and it has a different amino acid balance. And so when we think about how best do we utilize our distillers products, we really have to think about, if not competing with soybean meal, at least how do we complement soybean meal? So at the moment, livestock feed is the primary use for many of these products. And if you are thinking about using your stillage or stillage products as a livestock feed, as opposed to other uses, then we have to think about this. So about 80% in the US of the distillers grains are used in beef and dairy cattle. And then poultry and swine are going to comprise approximately 20% of the remaining quantity. Now, 2020 has been a very strange year. Back in April, about 50% of the US ethanol plants were closed due to COVID, but they have been slowly recovering. They're not quite back up to 100%. So I don't think 2020 we will see 40 million metric tons of distillers grains produced. We'll probably see between 25 and 30 million metric tons produced throughout the country. Next slide, please. So at the moment, when we think about feeding regimes, and there's still quite a lot of feeding research that's been conducted every year at various universities throughout the country and also throughout the world. Generally speaking, depending on the other ingredients, between 20 and 40% of a beef cattle diet can contain distillers grains. Dairy cattle, generally it's 10 to 30%. That number is creeping up because of some of the evolutions in the oil separation at many of the ethanol plants. Swine, it really depends on the least cost formulation. I know some companies who are feeding up to 50% of the ration as distillers grains. Poultry is a little more conservative, and it is going to be really difficult to convince a nutritionist to put in more than 10 to 15% of their diet as distillers grains. So in terms of the typical livestock, poultry has a lot of potential in terms of untapped market. But then we have other species such as aquaculture and pet foods that really, there is really untapped market potential for that. So that's something else to think about. Next slide, please. So just to kind of show you, I pulled this slide. This is the latest report for distillers grains prices. These are dried distillers grains, and these are export prices out of Chicago, but also out of New Orleans. So the light green is New Orleans. Sorry, light green is Chicago, dark green is New Orleans. You see that, like many commodities, the value for these products changes quite drastically over time. Historically, the dried products are about $120 to $150 per metric ton, but you do see some price peaks There are several, and that is primarily due to export demand. And so if you are thinking about utilizing your stillage in a dried form for a livestock feed, this is what you're going to have to compete with. And depending on what processes you use at your plant, if you can produce something for a lower cost but is as equally efficacious as a typical corn DDGS, then you've got an advantage. Next slide, please. So when livestock nutritionists are thinking about feed ingredients, least cost formulation is part of the story. And as I mentioned, corn is one of the chief competitors for our distillers products. And this bar or this graph is showing the value relative to corn. So the 100% mark means that the DDG is equivalent to corn in terms of value. If the graph is above the 100%, that means the distillery or the ethanol plant is receiving more value for that product than the value of corn, which is what you want. If the graph is below the 100% line, that means you're actually selling your distillers grains at a discount and you're not getting the full value. And historically, most of the ethanol plants and distilleries were selling their distillers grains at a discount, which, hey, as a livestock farmer, that's great because that's a cheap feed ingredient, but that's a loss to you at your distillery, unfortunately. So next slide, please. Soybean meal, you'll see that earlier this year, the value relative to soybean meal got up to about 75%, but historically, the value of distillers products are about half that of soybean meal. That's because it's based primarily on protein level, and soybean meal has a higher protein level compared to distillers products. Next slide, please. So just briefly, I'm going to go through the next couple slides kind of quickly because these are some thoughts, at least for you to consider as you think about different applications. Dewatering is potentially going to be important to you if you're trying to produce some type of a value add. Next slide, please. So depending on where you're located in the country or within the state of Kentucky, every city, every municipality has different cost structures in terms of their surcharges or their fines. I know many distilleries throughout the country, especially smaller distilleries, it's just easier to pay the surcharge and dump the stillage down for the municipality to treat. Some municipalities actually pay for carbon. I know that there are some, but historically, most cities have some type of a fee structure that you have to consider, especially if you're thinking, do we just send it down the drain or do we try to develop some type of a value added product? And that's something to consider. Next slide. So if you're thinking about some type of a value added application, separating water from the solids, and really we're talking separating water and dissolved solids from the suspended solids. So the suspended solids are what we typically sell either as distillers wet grains or distillers dry grains. It's more energy intensive to capture the dissolved solids out of that water. Some distilleries have evaporators set up so that they can capture those dissolved solids so that their water discharge actually is fairly pure. But evaporators cost even more money to operate than dryers do. So what we're trying to do really is reduce our nutrient load so that potentially we can reduce the surcharge going to the municipality. Next slide. And there are a variety of separators and cost-effective separators that we can use. Some are simple screens like this. Next slide, please. And some companies have found success using hydroclones to separate their solids from their water, to clarify their water. Next, please. Different types of filter presses, vacuum rotating presses are also used. Next slide. And different types of filter belts also have been successfully used at many companies. Next, please. One application that I am particularly intrigued with in the last couple of years is this small scale screening centrifuge. So this, at least I've been really impressed with this in terms of the efficacy of separation, but also the cost, because these are really relatively low cost compared to the large decanter centrifuges that are used at the large distilleries or the large ethanol plants. So these are cost effective. And what do I mean by that? Between $35,000 and $60,000 for a unit. And I think that these show some real promise. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that I work on at my university, but also with the council, is trying to understand costs of technologies. And if you were considering implementing one of these, what point do you break even? Because different technologies are going to be applicable to different companies, but scale matters, especially when we're thinking about break even. So if we think about a $35,000 separator that we just saw versus a $100,000 separator that a fuel ethanol plant would have, for example, you know, looking at the range of potential sales prices for wet cake is what we're really talking about. So those are typically going to sell throughout the United States for somewhere between $50 and $100 per metric ton. So just a simple calculation, if you were to install one of the small separators, if you're selling your wet cake at $50 a ton, you would need 700 tons of sales in order to break even. If the wet cake is selling for $100 a ton, then you would only need 350 tons. Now, one thing I do need to mention, wet cake sells for approximately half the price of dried distillers grains. And if you remember the graph from a few slides ago, there's well, depending on the year, there's a lot of potential variability over time. And the same is true for the wet cake. And so that's something to consider. If you were to think about a large scale production and a large separator, really you're talking between 1,000 and 2,000 tons of wet cake sales before you break even. Next slide, please. And so we can do cost estimations, and we can help companies do cost estimations to say, okay, if you're interested in this technology, what is the potential scale that you need to be at in order to make money? Because really, let's face it, we're trying to mitigate costs. If it's not cost effective to have the city handle your waste stillage, then you're going to have to find something else to do with it, but it has to be cost effective for your company. And so that's one of the things that we do. Next slide, please. So dewatering is part of the challenge if you're thinking about livestock feed, but it's also potentially a challenge depending on what other potential value-added applications you're interested in. Something I always like to tell groups, though, the greatest challenge for any company is not doing the dewatering of their stillage. It is marketing. It is outreach. It is helping your potential clients understand what it is you're producing. But it's also transportation, logistics, and storage as well. So you don't want some beef producer to call you up and say, hey, my feed bunks are frozen. I used your stillage, but it's the middle of January and I can't add any more, or the tank is frozen and I can't get the product out. And so these are other things that we have to think about. The separation at the plant really is the easy thing to do. So we've got the technologies for that. Next slide, please. I do want to spend just a couple minutes and talk about regulatory issues. Next slide, please. So historically, it's true. Most plants throughout the US, both beverage and fuel, have used their co-products or byproducts as livestock feed, unless they're sending it down for the municipality to deal with. So I know some of the previous speakers have alluded to this and talked about, you know, what is the capacity to sell your stillage to the beef industry or the other livestock industry throughout the state of Kentucky and surrounding states. And this question is not just happening in Kentucky, it's happening in every state in the US because of the growth of the small distilleries And ultimately in the US, it's been estimated that somewhere between 40 and 60 million metric tons of distillers products can be utilized. Now, we're producing about 40 million metric tons a year on a good year, but we're exporting between a quarter and a third of that, and that is the market dynamics. And so when we think about moving forward and the sustainability of our industries, we have to consider not just, how do we dewater this or how do we transport it and store it, but truly, how do we make products that livestock producers want? Cost is part of that, but so is the nutritional profiles. And depending on what your mash bill is, that's going to impact the potential nutrient content and nutrient availability for the livestock producers. And so it's going to be really important for you to understand, what does this mash bill actually equate to in terms of final product that we're trying to manufacture. And maybe livestock feed is not the best solution for everyone. Maybe we need to think about some of these other value added processes and products, whether it's nutraceuticals or the pet food industry or bioplastics or bioenergy. There's no one size fits all solution. And so I think that your feedback today is going to be really important, especially when we think about, what is the future of this industry? And it's going to continue to grow, and so our stillage quantities are going to continue to grow. Next slide, please. So if you are thinking about selling your products as an animal feed or a livestock feed, rest assured that legally you can sell this, because if you are doing a simple separation or a separation and a drying, there is an AFCO definition for the products that you produce. These AFCO definitions have been around since the late 1800s. They've been revised back in the 1950s and 60s, but really they haven't been modified very much over the last several decades. So we have definitions for distillers dried grains with solubles, distillers wet grains with solubles, condensed distillers solubles or syrup, or dried syrup. So what I'm putting these on here for those of you that may not be familiar with the AFCO definitions, but it's a legal requirement in the US that your product has to match a legal definition and meet the requirements in order to be sold. And if it does not, then the FDA can close your plant or levy fines against you. But the things that we produce in our industry match this. However, the biofuels industry is trying to evolve and move beyond just the traditional distillers products. And so we spend a lot of time working with the biofuels companies to try to understand what are some of these new products that they're making. Many of the plants are removing oil from their stillage and selling that either to the biodiesel industry or to the livestock industry as an oil product. But also many of the plants are now implementing yeast separation technologies, protein separation technologies, and fiber separation technologies to sell each of those streams at a concentrated level. For example, some of the newest technology can approach 80+% protein. Unfortunately, that doesn't meet a DDGS definition anymore, or even a DDG definition anymore. And so if you are doing some type of a novel process, you'll have to develop a new definition that will have to go through the AFCO and FDA approval process. Next slide, please. So it took about 2 to 3 years to develop the oil definition. And this is the current definition. It's T33.10, blank distillers oil feed grade. That blank is the predominating grain, either corn or wheat or rye, whatever your mash bill is. So if your company's interested in selling oil, there's a lot of money to be made in the oil removal and the sales of the oil. But once again, scale is going to matter. But you can now legally sell this to the livestock industry. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with the ingredient definition process, I would recommend that you spend some time and look at the AFCO website to understand that. But like I said a few minutes ago, if you are going to be doing some traditional physical separations and drying, for example, you already will be meeting the existing definitions. Next slide, please. So hopefully you're all familiar with the FDA and the Food Safety Modernization Act. This impacts every processing plant in the United States that's going to be producing any type of animal feed or human food. FDA's standpoint nowadays is animal feed is human food. It needs to be, because what the animals eat will ultimately end up in humans in the form of meat or milk or eggs or other products. And so I know the distillery industry throughout the US has worked really hard with FDA to try to make the implementation of FSMA more palatable and more doable, because the distilleries are already subject to many other stringent requirements. And so I would, if you're not familiar with these, I would get familiar with what does the Food Safety Modernization Act require of you if you are selling your stillage or stillage-based products into the animal feed industry. Next slide, please. And so with that, I would like to kind of wrap up. I do want to also mention there is a book that I wrote several years ago, Distillers Grains, Production, Processing, and Utilization. At the time, it was sort of the state of the art in terms of everything from corn kernel or wheat kernel or rye kernel all the way to the tail end of the cow. So it's getting a little bit dated. It's a couple years old, but the work I do at my university, the work I do with the Distillers Grains Technology Council, I think fits really well with what we're talking about today. And I think there's a lot of room for industry-wide collaboration to move forward and deal with this increasing issue of spent grains and stillage. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's a lot to think about. You know, when we talk about the economics of it, that's really the driver, and there's lots of layers in there. So we appreciate that, and I think we have some questions for you at the end. So while Carrie pulls up the other presentation, I'll just do a proper introduction of the folks that are going to be speaking collaboratively here. We have Angelica Vega, who's going to be representing Kentucky AGRITECH for the Cabinet for Economic Development. We have Ann M. Franklin from the Governor's Office of Agricultural Policy, Annie Franklin from the Cabinet for Economic Development, Slattery with the Cabinet for Economic Development, and Ellie Puckett with Kentucky Innovation Network, also with the Cabinet for Economic Development. So we thank you so much, ladies, for being with us this morning, and we will hand it over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having us. So as it was mentioned, my name is Angelica Sanchez Vega, and I am an executive advisor at the Cabinet for Economic Development, but I coordinate with the Governor's Office on the Kentucky AGRITECH initiative from the economic development perspective. So just kind of with that in mind, you know, this past summer, the Governor announced the Kentucky AGRITECH initiative. And the goal of the initiative is really to create an environment in the state that is conducive to the development and growth of technologies that improve the efficiency, productivity, sustainability, and reliability of the food supply. And that's from the research and development phase all the way to the end consumer. Now, the question that we often receive is, well, what in the world is AGRITECH, right, or AgTech? And while there's no single accepted definition, I mean, it's an evolving kind of definition. Think of it almost as an umbrella term. I wanted to give you just a few examples. You know, for purposes of what we're discussing here, I wanted to point out to you crop science and animal science as being one of this, what we think as an AGRITECH type sector or activity. Bioenergy and biomaterials, of course, and innovative food and ingredients. So like Kurt was mentioning, right, the possibility of maybe utilizing stillage for pet food. That would be, you know, an innovative ingredient type use. So now, having shown you these examples, let's not lose the forest for the trees though. Next slide. So at the heart of what we call agritech is just this basic perspective, right? Everyone eats and drinks, but there are pressures on our limited resources, and there's also a growing population, right? So agritech recognizes the value that can be generated at each step of the entire production and supply chain. It approaches challenges not as roadblocks, but as opportunities for innovation and the discovery of new applications. And it often looks for solutions via cross-industry collaboration. So this is why we're so excited to see this forum with so many diverse participants take place. Now, how is state government supporting, this proponents of cross-industry value-added focused approach to some of our beverage and food challenges here? Next slide, please. Well, first, we're convening players to discuss these challenges, just like we're doing right now. Another thing we're doing is we're coordinating and cooperating internally across the different cabinets to not only share information, but also to partner in developing solutions when it makes sense to do so. And then finally, we're contributing expertise and existing financial support programs to help those interested in innovative problem solving. So to begin sharing with us some of the support programs, I'll hand it over to Anne-Marie Franklin. Anne-Marie is with the Office of the Governor, I should say the Governor's Office of Agricultural Policy, and she'll share with us some resources that are available via that office. Anne-Marie?
Good morning, and thank you, Angelica. Within the Governor's Office of Agricultural Policy, we have many opportunities for financial support. The first, next slide, please. The first opportunity that I want to talk about is mainly our grant opportunities with the Kentucky Agricultural Development Fund, which is administered by the Kentucky Agricultural Development Board. The mission of the board is to invest funds in ways that can increase net farm income to impact tobacco farmers, communities, and agriculture across the state. We currently offer several programs on the state and county level for producers, entities, and research. Dorsey had mentioned in the beginning that this year we're approximately $6 million in investments across the state. Over the last about 20 years, we have invested approximately $635 million in projects throughout the state, which we're really proud of. Next slide, please. Aside from grants, we also have the KAFC, the Kentucky Agricultural Finance Corporation, which is also a part of the Ag Development Fund. So the KAFC addresses the unique financing needs of agriculture in the Commonwealth. The mission of the KAFC board is to strengthen agriculture across by providing access to low-interest loan programs through joint partnerships with local lending institutions. The KAFC assists beginning farmers, farm families, and agribusinesses to access necessary capital to establish, maintain, or expand their agricultural operation. All KAFC funding is to be limited to 50% of the project costs. And that also goes with the Ag Development Fund as well through the grants. Some of the loan programs distillers could participate in are the Ag Processing Loan, the Ag Infrastructure Loans, and diversification through entrepreneurship. Next slide, please. So you can see on the slide, there are several examples that we have funded through the Ag Processing Loan. It would be a perfect resource for those looking to implement agritech innovations into existing distilleries. As Kurt had mentioned some of those ideas previously, the goal of this loan program is to provide opportunities to companies and individuals interested in adding value to Kentucky-grown agricultural commodities through further processing. So some eligible product or projects could be acquisition of equipment, construction or expansion of facilities, renovation, and permanent working capital. So if you have questions about the grants or loans that we have here at GOAP, you can visit our website at agpolicy.ky.gov and check us out there, or feel free to call the office. I will now turn it over to the other Annie Franklin.
Thank you, Anne Marie. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having us. Both Kristina Slattery and I will be sharing a little bit about what the Cabinet for Economic Development can offer our distilleries and our manufacturers. So I'll let Kristina get started. Carrie, if you don't mind shifting over to the next slide. Actually, I'll get started on this one. So Claremont Distillery is a project that I worked on, and it's one of our most recent project announcements here in Kentucky. Lee Wilburn is a very successful developer. He's worked on some major projects across the country, and one of his passion projects was actually developing a distillery, and he decided to do it here in Kentucky. This project was a $13.4 million project that anticipated a growth of 22 jobs, ranging from $56 an hour for these jobs of operational to managerial positions. So we're excited to have Claremont Distillery here in Kentucky. They should be breaking ground spring of 2021. But this is just a success story of many that we've had in the state that have worked with our cabinet in applying for incentives and working with our communications team to provide some amazing press releases that have been shared across the state and regionally for that matter. So again, we're happy to have them here, and we're hopeful for the years to come of new distilleries that plan to work with our team and break ground in Kentucky. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Annie. I'm Kristina Slattery. I am our Deputy Commissioner of Business Development. We will take just a moment here to talk about how Kentucky has fared, in 2020 by way of projects, jobs announced, and investment that has occurred. So far this year, through December 15th, we have had 213 expansions and new location projects announced. So those will break out here in just a moment, a little bit more detail. Those 213 projects equate to 7,800 new Kentucky full-time positions and over $2 billion in investment. So we're, really proud of that as a state, especially given the circumstances that we've worked under. I'll just say that, out of these investments, many of them were from food and beverage. So almost $1 billion of that announced investment came from the food and beverage industry, which spirits are a subset of. Next slide, please. So Annie talked about one particular project already. There were many in the spirits. We had 21 different announcements this year just from the spirits industry. So, when we look back over the last several years, you'll see that 80% of our announcements came from our existing industry. So while we love welcoming new players to the state of Kentucky, it's really critical for us to take care of our existing companies, because this shows that they're successful here in Kentucky and that they're continuing to grow. Next slide, please. Annie is our target market specialist for food and beverage, and so I'm going to let you talk a little bit more just about how we stack up in Kentucky here.
Thanks, Kristina. So as she mentioned, I focus on food and beverage as well as agribusiness related projects, and it's been exciting to watch this industry really grow rapidly within the state. Kentucky really is leading the way in the food and beverage industry, and agriculture is a part of the supply chain. So if the food and beverage industry is growing, that means agriculture is growing as well. And we're already a big agriculture state, so we've got a lot more room to fill and to grow in those industries. But I just wanted to share that each of these bullet points highlights Kentucky's many successes in the industry, and distilleries make up a large part of that. As many of you, I'm sure, know, 95% of the world's bourbon is produced here in Kentucky, and many of the jobs that are here in Kentucky are based within the beverage manufacturing space. So just looking at some of the bullet points, 52,000 plus employees are just within the food and beverage space. Over $4 billion are investments in the last 5 years within the space as well as 6,400 new jobs announced. So we're really proud of that and excited for what the future holds here in Kentucky. Next slide, please. And here is our proof. And yes, I'm playing on words and tipping my hat to the distillers here. Over 300 facilities in Kentucky are food and beverage facilities. And as you can see on the map, they range all over the state. We obviously do have more facilities in some of our more populous areas, but a food and beverage facility can locate in any one of our 120 counties, that being also distilleries as well. Next slide, please.
So, and before we get into sort of some of the different programs and services within the cabinet, we just want to, thank our distillers that are tuning in. You all really help us to tell the Kentucky story. We're fortunate in that the brand recognition that Kentucky bourbon gives us, when we're talking to potential customers or companies overseas, they are familiar with Kentucky bourbon and the Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Fried Chicken, and that is an advantage, that brand recognition that other states don't have. So just overviewing here the resources that our cabinet can provide. Obviously, there are incentives that I'll talk about here in just a moment. But we work a lot with communities to help communities be ready to respond to company needs. So whether that be, through workforce support or site readiness programs, our goal is to really do whatever we can to support our communities and our companies to grow and invest in Kentucky. Next slide, please. All of our incentive programs are listed and fully transparent on our website. So you can find information about any of our programs that we or Ellie will be discussing today at the Economic Development Cabinet's website. And I'll talk about two of them that many of our distillers have utilized in the past. Next slide, please. So the first and most commonly used program in Kentucky, and many states have something that's very similar to this, is the Kentucky Business Investment Program, or the KBI. So you see here, the types of companies that are eligible. The minimum investment on this program is $100,000 and the creation of 10 new full-time jobs. So this is a program we use for small projects with 15 jobs. It's the same program we used to incentivize Amazon in Northern Kentucky when they decided to do a prime air hub here. So this really is our most reliable program. And this program really gives you two methods to recover your investment. One being through a corporate income tax credit if you've got liability to the state of Kentucky. The second being recovering a portion of a wage assessment on the new employees that are hired. This is really a long-term program. It can be a 10 to 15-year program depending on where you are located in the state, and really is a performance-based tax credit. Next slide, please. So I would say many of our distillers are familiar with this program. The Kentucky Enterprise Initiative Act is pretty simple. It's a sales tax refund. So as you all are building out those warehouses, you're paying 6% sales tax on the lumber and the racking and the things that those physical building and construction materials that go into those. And Kentucky will allow you to recover a portion of that sales tax through this program. Pretty simple. After we take the project for approval, you spend the money, do the build, and keep those invoices, and then come back to the state. We work with revenue to refund a portion of those costs. Next slide, please. On the workforce front, there are a lot of resources available through our cabinet and through partner agencies like the Kentucky Community and Technical College, the Kentucky Career Centers, the Education and Workforce Cabinet. So I would encourage you, if there is a workforce need that you have, whether that's needing a job fair to some sort of a customized training that KCTCS could deliver, registered apprenticeship, please reach out to us and we'll get you to the right place to help with those workforce resources. One thing that our cabinet does administer are training incentives. Next slide, please. I'll talk about those a little bit more. So we have within the Bluegrass State Skills Corporation 2 different programs, a grant and a tax credit that are really designed to offset training costs. So the grant, again, pretty straightforward. You spend money on training, whether that's in-house or through a third-party entity, and the grant and aid can refund up to 50% of those costs. The skills training investment credit is very similar. So you can get a certain dollar amount per employee that you train in a tax credit that can be carried forward for 3 years. So without getting too far into the details, if you have questions about any of these programs, call myself, call Annie directly, and we would be happy to work with you on those. So, Annie and I typically work with some of the larger industries and distillers, but, we have another subset of our cabinet, which is Kentucky Innovation, led by Ellie Puckett, that I'm going to turn it over to now to talk about those resources.
Thank you, Kristina. I appreciate your transition. Hi, my name is Ellie Puckett. I am the Deputy Executive Director for KY Innovation. KY Innovation is focused on building the economy through entrepreneurs and innovators, and really what I would call the future big businesses of Kentucky. Next slide. And we do this through a number of programs and resources. First, we have our KY Innovation Hubs, and I'm going to go into more about what each of these programs, and not each of them, but some of them of these programs and resources. But the KY Innovation Hubs is our most important because it is strategically placed throughout the state, and it provides services to entrepreneurs. Kentucky Commercialization Ventures. We also have a number of programs aimed at students who are looking to start businesses. We have several funding mechanisms, including an angel investment fund, 2 different angel investment funds. Then we have things that are like SBIR and federal grant matching programs, as well as a set of different tax credits, some of which make a lot of sense here and some may not, but as a whole, we are focused on the new and growing startup or technology business. Next. The KY Innovation Hubs are supporting the ecosystem on boots on the ground. They host events, they do one-on-one startup coaching, they can connect people to investors, mentors, university resources, service providers, and more. This is really important because in the as Angelica pointed out earlier, challenges are opportunities. And so the way that we see this is if you are in one of those businesses or if you've been thinking about how you might solve the distiller's grain challenges and have new innovative ideas or a business that might come from this opportunity, we are here to partner with you, and we have resources that aren't just about giving you an incentive, but are actually coaching you through that business model and helping you figure out how to do everything from file for an LLC or C Corp to finding the right investors at the right times, and so on and so forth. Our next program, actually, let me show you where those are across the state. So next slide. We have 6 offices strategically located throughout the state. What I will say is the SOAR Innovation Group in Pikeville actually has people all throughout Eastern Kentucky. So they have a person in Moorhead, and they have a person in Clay County, I believe, and several others. And the same is true of our Western Kentucky office. And our Bowling Green office has a person in E-Town. So if you are in one of the rural communities and you have an idea, often one of our people will come to meet you where you're at. Right now, we're doing that digitally, but we have resources and people to meet with you on a one-on-one basis and help you figure out where you're headed. Next slide. The Kentucky Commercialization Ventures program is new this year, and it is actually a public-private partnership through our colleges and universities. And it is actually, if you are in a college and university, and several people on this call have been, and you have an idea that you want to bring to market, the Kentucky Commercialization Ventures program is here to walk you through that process and help you take your IP, figure out how to license it with your university, and move it to a full-blown business. And so that is the program that is facing the universities and the colleges. It also can provide a resource to the community if you are a person in the community trying to figure out who the right person in all these university systems are to help you. It has a really good two-way relationship building look into the university structures and their resources. So next slide. As I said, it's a partnership between KY Innovation, the Kentucky Science and Technology Corporation, and all of the state's colleges and universities. Next. So I'm going to highlight 2 programs. One is the Kentucky Small Business Tax Credit. This is probably our most used program. Well, popular program. Our most used program is probably our Angel Investment Tax Credit, but in the KY Innovation office. And it is a tax credit for businesses that are creating full-time jobs and investing $5,000 in qualifying equipment or technology. This is really awesome because it comes directly off of your employee sales tax, income tax. I'm losing the words for it. Sorry about that. It is a rolling program. You can apply for it at any time in the year. A lot of people often think that they have to wait until the end of the year to do it, and you can absolutely do that at the end of the year, but you can also apply for it in January as well. So since we're looking at the end of the year, you haven't missed your opportunity. Please get in touch and we can work with someone to help you get your small business tax credit. Next slide. And then the last is actually the Selling Farmer Tax Credit, and it's kind of the partner program to the program in the Governor's Office of Agriculture Policy. So if you are a person who has a farm that is ready to sell, this program allows you to get a tax credit to offset like capital gains if you're selling to a beginning farmer. If you are a beginning farmer looking for a farm to buy, please let the person who's looking at selling know about this program. And this is one of our more agriculture related programs, our only agriculture specific program. But as I mentioned, we have an angel investment tax credit and a fund tax credit and some other innovation related programming and incentives that all go cross industry. So if you're in the ag tech industry, please reach out to KY Innovation. We're here to help. Next slide. I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
All right, good deal. Thank you very much. At this time, we will take questions. Paulette, do we have any questions for folks?
We actually do have a couple of questions. The first two questions are specifically addressed to Kurt. Kevin Smith writes, although the fuel ethanol distilleries are competitors for byproduct sales, that industry has also opened a much wider door for beverage distillery byproducts to take advantage of. This is especially true of higher value-added products such as high protein DDGs. Maybe Kurt can comment on and identify opportunities specific to beverage distillery byproducts.
That's a great question. Kevin, thank you very much. It's glad you were able to make it today. So yeah, that's a really good question. So the fuel ethanol industry really learned so much from the beverage industry and really has evolved out of the beverage industry. And over the last 20 years, they continue to push forward. And you know, their business model is different from the beverage model. Their model is bring in corn as cheaply as possible, make alcohol, sell it into the fuel market, and unfortunately, the fuel prices aren't very high right now. So what the ethanol companies are understanding finally is that the key to not just profitability, but the key to survival is the unfermented materials, the proteins and the fibers and the nutraceuticals, for example. So starting back in about 2011, we saw a few of the ethanol plants start installing new types of centrifuges to remove the oil out of stillage. And in just a matter of 5 years, almost, not 100%, but it's about 97% of the ethanol plants in the US, and there are about 215 ethanol plants right now throughout the US. About 97% of them have installed the oil separation centrifuges because they have found that they can actually make quite a bit of money by selling the corn oil, the distiller's corn oil, to the livestock producers. So, you know, the economic conditions for the ethanol plants are much different than they are for the beverage plants. And the fuel plants now, as I mentioned, they're starting to implement some new technologies, especially pulled out of the corn wet milling industry to separate the protein from the fiber and to produce some high protein types of products. So Kevin, your question about, you know, what advantages potentially could distilleries offer. So especially in, you know, something that, you know, I think about frequently, you know, a state like Kentucky, where, you know, the fuel industry is not so large. The biofuel industry is not so large in Kentucky. So if your livestock producers are interested in using distillers products, they'll have to purchase those at a feed company, which will have to be probably incorporate or shipped in from another state, primarily from the Midwest. So the first advantage that distilleries in Kentucky have is location. You know, the old saying about location, location, location for real estate. I think that's also true for feed ingredients. And so that's part of the story. Using wet ingredients, if you separate the water and the dissolved solids, for example, and you are selling your suspended solids as a wet cake, you know, really we're talking about beef. And I know that the beef industry, trying to use more distillers products in the beef industry in Kentucky is potentially problematic. You know, really the wet products, you know, we're looking at about a 50-mile transportation distance, really to be cost effective for both the distillery as well as the farmer. So you get much beyond 50 miles. I mean, water is expensive to transport. And if we're talking the wet cake, we're really talking, you know, 50 to 70% water, even though we've done a dewatering step. Something I would like the group to consider, you know, it's not just corn that you're fermenting. You're fermenting wheat and barley and rye and a variety of other grains and other ingredients. And when you go through a fermentation process, what you're really doing is concentrating everything except the starch by a factor of about 3 times. So one of the advantages I think that you would have, especially if you have a unique mash bill, you can be producing a unique feed product, and or a series of feed products. And so I think it's going to be important for you to understand, what is the proximate composition of the products that you're producing: protein, fat, fiber, ash. But there are, we're talking about arabinoxylans in one of the previous talks. There are some specific benefits to some of these, non-corn cereal grains. So I think it's going to be important for you to understand, what is the composition and what is the efficacy in a livestock diet. But then you think about, the pharmaceuticals or nutraceuticals. That's a much higher value, and so the separation technology, whether it's at your plant or maybe it's a central hub that's pulling stillage from multiple plants, I think there's some really interesting opportunities with the nutraceuticals, especially antioxidants from the pigments from the cereal grains that I think is a real advantage. So those are some thoughts. I could go on for hours and hours, but in the interest of time, I think I'll stop. But that's a great question, Kevin.
Jim Ling is asking, you mentioned a $35,000 solution and a $100,000 centrifuge to do high-speed decanting, and was wondering if you could mention what manufacturers you were specifically referencing.
I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I've got, I could actually email to you or email to the organizers of the conference, this group. I don't want to plug a specific manufacturer too much, but there's only a handful of these small manufacturers. I would be very happy to share the link with the organizers if you'd like.
Great, thanks so much. And Jim actually also asked a question of the group as a whole, if there is someone who can help him identify loans or grant resources for micro distilleries that would be available for equipment upgrades and improving the dewatering process.
Kristina, you may want to, I guess, correct me here if I'm wrong. I know that the KIA program that you spoke about has some component, right, that can be applicable for this type of equipment, new equipment going into a business. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so for the sales tax refund program, building and construction equipment, electronic processing equipment, and research and development equipment are all eligible cost. But I would recommend, if you want to reach out, our contact information should be available. Reach out to Annie, Franklin, or myself, or both. We'll hear more about the project and get you to the right place.
I will also say at the Governor's Office of Ag Policy, we have opportunities. So feel free to reach out to me, and I can provide you some information and get you into contact with the right loan manager here or a project manager.
Thank you all so much for that. We've also received a question if anyone has studied the BTU value of pelletized dewatered distilled grains.
Yes, actually.
You're saving us, Kurt. You're saving us.
His follow-up question is, so can you provide additional information on that in terms of what it is or a publication that might be available?
It looks like Kurt has frozen.
Oh, no.
Well, I
Those are
believe he's
economic
having
development.
some computer issues, but we can definitely follow up with some information and provide, you know, the attendees with that information later on.
Wonderful. That's all the questions we have so far.
All right, good deal. Well, hopefully we can get Kurt back, unfortunately. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for your presentations. We appreciate that. Obviously, you all, you know, play an important role in this in terms of, you know, helping us identify resources and making things go sometimes. So we appreciate that. And we will make the contact information available to all the folks on the webinar this morning. Once again, thank you for helping us out